This car was hot. Hi everyone, I'm Kennan from Cars and Bids, and today we're talking about this, the Ferrari F430 Spider, one of my all-time favorite modern Ferraris. And in today's video, we're going to be discussing all of its facts and figures. First, we'll talk about its history and where it fits into Ferrari's past. Then we'll get nerdy and talk about some of those technical details, and then we'll take it for a drive. Before I get going though, surprise, surprise, this F430 is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. As I mentioned, this is a 2006 F430 Spider, which was the first year production for the F430 Spider here in the United States. And this one is really special as it has less than 370 miles on its odometer. It also comes with some very desirable factory equipment, including the SCUDERIA fender shields, the Daytona seat inserts, and some interior carbon fiber trim. But it also has a lot of its peripherals, including the F430 branded baseball caps, which is just insane. And so after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below where you can head to the live auction of this one, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. And we begin the story of the F430 by talking about its past and how Ferrari used to develop their mid-engine two-seater V8 sports cars. This all began with the 308 in the late 1970s, and that was its own new platform. But they would go to significantly improve that car over its life cycle, and eventually they would introduce the 328, which again was based on the same platform as the 308. Ferrari would do this again in the late 1980s when they developed the 348 platform, and again a totally new platform for them, but they would refine that car over time, and eventually the new 355 in the mid-90s would be based on that platform. Then in 1999, Ferrari would come out with the 360, which marked a huge departure from the cars that came before it. It used a lot more modern technology in its construction, and it would use a lot of aluminum. Then in 2004, building on the 360, at the Paris Motor Show, Ferrari gave us this, the F430, which looked dramatically different than the 360 that preceded it. It was lower, sleeker, and more aerodynamic than that car, and it introduced a lot of technology into the V8 Ferrari range. From its inception, this car was a huge hit. Everybody wanted to get their hands on the new hot Ferrari. And when it eventually ended up with journalists, people were blown away. Every review of this car when it came out said that it was a quantum leap over the 360. And well, that's no surprise. Ferrari introduced a lot of technology into this car, but they also introduced a totally new engine, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And as a result, this car was hot. Everybody wanted to own this car, and quickly the waiting list expanded to 2 years, and people just had to have the F430. This demand would continue throughout the car's production, and Ferrari would build over 15,000 of these, making it one of the most successful models in their history. Over that time, they would produce several different versions of this car, beginning with the Coupe, the Berlinetta version, which had a hardtop. Then they would offer this car, the fully convertible Spider version, and then they would offer track-focused versions like the SCUDERIA and its limited edition convertible variant, the 16M. They would also offer a stripped-out, track-focused racing version of this car called the Challenge. But regardless which version you pick, this car was beloved by the people who owned it. It was a tremendous car to drive, and over time, it developed a reputation for being, well, pretty reliable and relatively usable compared to the Ferraris that had come before it. And coupled with modern-day performance, well, it's no surprise that the F430 remains an extremely desirable car today. And now it's time to talk about the design of the F430, because it marked a big departure from the 360, and you need a little bit of context to really appreciate it. This car comes from the Luca di Montezemolo era of Ferrari, Ferrari's chairman at the time, and he placed an emphasis on design simplicity. He didn't like the idea of adding huge wings and spoilers to cars, as he felt it, well, kind of dated the way a car looked. And so he dictated to his engineers that the car had to look refined and simplistic, but it had to generate a lot more downforce than its predecessor. And so engineers set to work on designing the F430, and it meant that they had to get pretty creative. We're going to begin by looking at the design by, well, looking at the front of this car, and it's important to note that Ferrari likes to incorporate design elements from older cars into their current production cars, and well, the F430 is no exception. Located on the front bumper are these two scalloped elements, and these come from the famed Ferrari 156 Shark Nose race car of the 1960s. That car would win Phil Hill his 1961 Formula One World Championship, and Ferrari thought that it would be appropriate to reintroduce that design element here on the F430. But these design pieces aren't just skin deep. Of course, they have function. Located behind the grills in these scallops are radiators to help keep elements of this car cool, and on the front bumper there are also relief cuts to allow air to flow back out of these radiators once it's done its job cooling the car down. If you look very closely, there's a very subtle spoiler which cleans up the airflow as it passes underneath this car. Ferrari claims that this spoiler, in conjunction with the other changes to the front of this car, will generate 290 pounds of downforce at top speed, which is significant. As you go faster, you want to have more control over the steering, and because you have more weight pressing down on the wheels, well, it gives you even more control. So although it's incredibly subtle, this is one of the changes that the engineers made to this car to give you more control at high speed. And now we move to the rear of the F430, where the changes compared to the 360 become significantly more apparent. Ferrari would take inspiration from their supercar of the early 2000s, the Enzo, when designing the rear of this car. They would carry over the quad taillight design and this grille that's located between them in order to mimic the look of the Enzo. They would also introduce some very subtle design elements for aerodynamic purposes, including this very slightly lipped deck lid, which helps generate some downforce at the rear of this car. Less subtle, though, would be this gigantic rear diffuser that's located here between the exhausts. The idea with a rear diffuser that's, well, as aggressive as this one is that it helps accelerate airflow out the back of the car, which then sucks it to the ground. And the aerodynamic changes to this car between the lipped deck lid and this rear diffuser meant that this car generated about 330 more pounds of downforce at full speed. All in all, the aerodynamic changes to this car meant that it generated 618 pounds of downforce at top speed, which is a lot. And this was a big deal because this car had the same drag coefficient as the 360, meaning it lost none of its efficiency cutting through the air, but this car was significantly more stable at high speed. Now it's time to talk about one of the most significant upgrades to the F430, and that is back here with its engine. Now the name for the F430 comes from, well, its engine. This engine displaces 4.3 liters, hence F430, and it makes 483 horsepower and 343 foot-pounds of torque, which is a big jump over the 360. It makes 25% more horsepower and 23% more torque. The result is this car does 0 to 60 in about 4 seconds and has a top speed of 196 miles an hour, which is, again, a big leap over the 360 that came before it. But this engine was one of the stars of the show with this Ferrari, as it was a clean sheet redesign compared to the 360's engine that came before it. Although this engine is larger than the V8 that's found in the 360, as it went up by 0.7 of a liter, it only weighs 8.8 pounds more than the engine found in the 360. But critically, dimensionally, it's also smaller. Ferrari would reduce the space between the cylinders of this car to make it more compact, but they didn't stop there. Ferrari also wanted to get rid of the rubber belt-driven system that came on the 360, and so they developed a timing chain system for this car. The huge benefits of that was, well, it was a lot easier to live with. You didn't have to have these frequent belt services like you did with every Ferrari before that, but it also meant that dimensionally the engine could be yet again smaller. The benefits of making this engine smaller meant that Ferrari could mount it further in the car and lower down than they could with the 360, which enhanced the handling of this car significantly. So although yes, it makes a lot more power, this engine was also a much smaller, much more efficient design compared to the 360. The internals of this engine were also completely overhauled. Ferrari would redesign the pistons, connecting rods, and the crankshaft for this car to make it even more efficient. Ferrari would also innovate on the cylinder head for this car. They would use a traditional 4 valves per cylinder design, but the inlet valve technology was taken directly from Formula One cars of the era. The whole design there was they wanted to maximize the volumetric efficiency of this engine, and so they did that by redeveloping the inlet valves. The result of all of these changes means that this engine is extremely efficient. It has an 11.3 to 1 compression ratio, and given its displacement, it has a very high specific output. But there's another aspect of this engine I want to talk about, and that is that it is a flat plane crank V8. Now we hear that term a lot, but what does that actually mean? It refers to the crank pins that are located in this engine, as they're mounted at 180 degrees from one another, which is a flat plane. The result of this is that this engine is extremely efficient. And Ferrari chooses this design because they like small displacement, high efficiency, high revving engines. And so having a flat plane crank allows them to achieve this. For packaging reasons and for efficiency, Ferrari likes the flat plane crank V8. The last thing I want to discuss with this engine would be its induction system, which is on very clear display on the top of this engine. Now, Ferrari wanted to maximize the amount of airflow, and they wanted to make sure it got into the engine as cleanly as possible. And they did this by using old racing technology. They created these long intake tubes. They're long on top and they're long on the bottom too, as the engine is mounted way down low as possible in this car. The result is that airflow is nice and clean as it enters the combustion chamber, meaning that you maximize the volumetric efficiency of the air channels in this car. But Ferrari wasn't done there. They also have pneumatic drums that are located in this system, which rotate to determine how much airflow makes it into the cylinders. And the result of this is that Ferrari was able to maximize the fluid dynamics of this engine, and that's why they're able to squeeze so much power out of a 4.3 liter V8. Now we move inside of the F430, and there are a couple of things I want to discuss in here that were a big deal for Ferrari. One is the transmission. So this car was offered with two different transmissions. You could buy the sequential manual gearbox, which you see here, the F1 system, or you could get this car with a 6-speed manual transmission. Now this was the last mid-engine V8 Ferrari to be offered from the factory with a 6-speed manual. So it's a significant car in Ferrari's history, even though this car is an F1 car, not a manual transmission. But the development to the drivetrain wouldn't end there. Ferrari would also introduce their eDiff, or electronic differential system, into the F430. The way this works is that there are a series of sensors located throughout the car that take in various information, including throttle position sensor, pitch and yaw angles, things like that, and process them in this car's computer. When the car senses that it needs more grip in a high-performance driving situation, it will pump hydraulic fluid into the differential, compressing the clutch packs that are located within it. This allows the power to be more directly transmitted to the rear wheels, giving you more traction. The major innovation with this system, though, was that it was adjustable, and that's done with this little switch known as the Manatino. By rotating this switch to various predetermined selections, Ferrari would allow you to pick what kind of driving characteristics you wanted from the car based on how you were using it. The computer would allow this car to slide a little bit more into corners and allow you to have a little bit more fun before the traction control would intervene. Or you can turn the system off altogether. And this was a big deal, as the 360 did not have this technology, and Ferrari continues to use this technology today. And so the F430 has a lot of technology, especially for its time, but that wasn't done just to show off. It was all done to make sure that the driver had the most fun possible in the F430. Okay, it's time to drive the F430, and I wanted to start this video by talking a little bit about how to drive an F1 transmission. As I said in the video, this car is available with either a manual transmission or the F1 transmission like this car has, and I want to do a little bit explaining how it works. Underneath, this is still a manual transmission. So you have to drive this car like it's manual. You're not operating the clutch, obviously the computer is, but you have to treat it like it's a manual transmission. So what does that mean? That means like when you're on a hill, just anticipate that the car is gonna wanna wear the clutch, so try to avoid hills and try to like get on the gas as quickly as possible so that the car knows to drop the clutch in a little bit more aggressively. The other thing to note with this car is like on downshifts, if you flip the throttle just slightly, it'll smooth out the downshift significantly with this car. So that's one of the big things that people don't understand is you gotta do those little things. Additionally, like when you pull the pedal going up, you can kind of gently come off the throttle a little bit, just like a manual transmission car. When you're at full throttle and you're really going for it, you keep your foot planted and the car will handle the shifts. But basically, the whole point I want to make with this is when you're driving one of these F1 transmission cars, you have to work with the car. It's not just like some automatic where the car does all the work. You have to put in some of the effort with the car. First thing, you got a traditional handbrake, so we'll put that off. Car is currently in neutral. We're gonna pull the right-hand side paddle to put it in gear. Now we're in first gear. Then I get on the throttle a little bit. You can hear it wears the clutch a little bit there, just like gently letting it out. And now we're in gear. I'm gonna pull the paddle, come off a little bit, roll back on. Nice and smooth. Very easy to do. And super comfortable. Downshifting, I'm gonna pull the paddle, whip the throttle a little bit, nice and smooth downshift. So those are the things you have to think about as you're driving this car. You can't just like sit back and not think about any of that stuff. You have to be involved with operating this car. I also want to talk about, I have a little story with the F430. So when I was a kid, this was the brand new Ferrari. This car was fresh out of the factory, and it was so hot. So much so that I remember watching reviews and everybody was just in love with this car. And as a result, people were just like, there was a buzz around the F430 as it was, you know, the Ferrari to have. Oh, and frankly, it's easy to see why. The star of the show is that engine. That engine was brand new at the time. It was a whole different approach to the V8. It was much larger than the Dino V8s that came before it. The way it delivers performance was a huge change from the earlier Ferrari V8s. But this car was so important. I remember I was in Ohio, it was Thanksgiving, and there's one Ferrari dealership in Ohio, it's in Columbus. I was visiting my aunt and I was so excited that we were going to be near to a new Ferrari dealership. I wanted to go see the new Ferrari. And so we went, and as a 10-year-old kid, there it was, the brand new Ferrari that I had been reading about. And the salesman was so nice, let me sit in the car and experience it. And I was wearing my little Ferrari polo and all these things. And I remember that like it was yesterday. And so I'm kind of nostalgic about the F430, and I can't believe these cars are as old as they are now, because they still look modern, they still feel modern. And that, frankly, is part of the appeal with this car, is that it still feels like a modern car, has modern performance. They're relatively reliable, and they still look awesome. I gotta say, like, I've been fortunate enough, I've spent a lot of time in F430s. This is one of the nicest I've ever seen. It's one of the lowest mileage I've ever experienced. And so this kind of comes full circle from when I saw this car as a kid. It's like driving one brand new. And my God, it's awesome. This car is just so responsive and like, it's fun. And the performance feels modern and it looks modern. And yeah, it's really good. The 430 got a lot of praise when it was new. It still frankly deserves all of that praise today. And because these cars are relatively reliable, you know, they become pretty sought after by people, and it's pretty easy to see why. This car offers a phenomenal driving experience. Granted, this one is so low mileage, this is more of a museum quality car, to be totally honest with you. But that said, it's awesome. Let's do that again. Full power, here we go. Man. Oh, so good. Oh. But handling wise, it's super agile. Power-wise, it's excellent, and I gotta say the suspension's really compliant. I just have it in sport. If I switch to race, you can feel the suspension get a little firmer. This car has a relatively conventional suspension system as far as Ferraris go, you know, double wishbones at all 4 points, but it does have adjustable suspension that's tuned with the Manatino, but you can dial it into however you want the car to drive. And it's an experience. It's the Ferrari experience. This car represents a very high watermark for Ferrari. You know, they were dominating Formula 1 at the time. It shows. They really put their technical know-how behind this car, went full cow to this thing, gave it an amazing engine, you know, improved even more on the 360's driving dynamics. And like, as a result, this car has aged so gracefully. I love this car. It's awesome. And that is the Ferrari F430 Spider. This car was a big deal for Ferrari as it introduced a lot of new technology into the V8 line, but it maintained the old school feel of a naturally aspirated mid-engine Ferrari. And this one is unbelievably nice. And if you're in the market for one of these, well, you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye.